This lecture is on operant conditioning, which is also in Chapter 6 along with classical conditioning. So I know we defined this in the classical conditioning PowerPoint if you watched that, but let's define it again. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. Learning involves acquiring knowledge and skills through experience. So our experiences lead to how we learn. So let's look at learning through operant conditioning. Let's define operant conditioning. It is when an organism learns to associate a behavior and its consequence. So again, if you watched the PowerPoint on classical conditioning, then you know that the word associate is huge when it comes to learning. So there's an association between a behavior, an action, and its consequence. Let's look a little bit further at operant conditioning. The law of effect. Behaviors that are followed by consequences that are satisfying to the organism make sense or are more likely to be repeated, which makes sense. And behaviors that are followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated, which also makes sense. Essentially, if an organism does something that brings about a desired result, the organism is more likely to do it again. And if an organism does something that does not bring about a desired result, the organism is less likely to do it again. B.F. Skinner was the first to develop an experiment to study operant conditioning, so the video below is just really brief, and it discusses his experiment, which was the Skinner box experiment. So be sure and watch that, and I think you'll get a better idea of operant conditioning. So let's look at positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So positive reinforcement is when a desirable stimulus is added to increase the behavior. So something positive, something desirable is added to increase a behavior. There's also positive punishment, which is when an undesirable stimulus is added to decrease a behavior. Negative reinforcement, an undesirable stimulus is removed to increase a behavior. In negative punishment, a desirable stimulus is taken away to decrease a behavior. So it's all about taking things away or adding things to change a behavior. So let's look at a diagram that kind of simplifies what we just discussed. You can see positive reinforcement is when you add a pleasant stimulus to increase a behavior. Positive punishment is when you add an aversive stimulus to decrease behavior. Negative reinforcement is when you remove an aversive stimulus to increase behavior. Negative punishment is you remove a pleasant stimulus to decrease behavior. So let's look at an example, some real life examples of that. An example of positive reinforcement would be a teacher giving a gold star for doing homework. I'm sure we've probably all had that experience where we were given something positive, something good, so we would repeat that behavior. Negative reinforcement would be a seatbelt buzzer turns off after a driver finally buckles the belt. So it's a relief for that seatbelt buzzer to turn off after you buckle your belt. And we want you to further that behavior of buckling your belt. Positive punishment would be when a parent spanks a child for coloring on the walls. So they're delivering a negative action to decrease a behavior. Negative punishment would be when a school takes away a student's right to go on a trip after he's caught smoking in the bathroom. So those are some real-world examples of positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. Let's look at some other concepts that go along with operant conditioning. The first is called shaping. Shaping means identifying the final goal behavior and breaking it down into smaller achievable steps and providing reinforcement for progress at each step. Instead of waiting for a learner to perform the full skill all at once, Shaping allows us to build that skill over time, creating a pathway for success without overwhelming them. I know we've discussed that when you have a large goal, sometimes it's easier to divide that into smaller little goals, and you eventually get to the larger goal. That's essentially what shaping is. There's this huge goal, huge behavior you want to see change, and you don't think you can change it all at once. So you shape little behaviors to ultimately get to that. Let's look at an example. If I want to teach my child to put on a coat, and he or she is resistant, I might use shaping to increase this behavior. So first, I might offer positive reinforcement for walking toward the coat, for simply doing that. Then I might offer positive reinforcement for walking toward the coat and touching the coat. And then I eventually might offer positive reinforcement for walking toward the coat, touching the coat, and finally for putting the coat on. So it's really just taking tiny steps to get to a big goal is what shaping is. Let's look at the difference between a primary and a secondary reinforcer. A primary reinforcer are reinforcers that have innate reinforcing qualities. These kinds of reinforcers are not learned. So pay attention to those words, not learned. You don't have to learn about these reinforcers. For example, water, food, sleep, shelter, sex, and touch, among other things, are primary reinforcers. They don't have to be learned. A secondary reinforcer is a stimulus that reinforces a behavior after it has been associated with a primary reinforcer. And this is really similar to classical conditioning. For example, when you give your dog a food treat and tell him good boy, he's getting both the primary reinforcer of the treat. You don't have to learn to associate food with being positive, and the secondary reinforcer of the verbal praise, which then, again, very much like classical conditioning, the verbal praise ends up being associated with the food. Continuous and partial reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is defined as a reinforcement schedule where the target behavior is reinforced each and every time it occurs, leading to the most rapid learning of new behavior. So you receive positive reinforcement every time that behavior occurs, and so you're rapidly going to learn about the association. Partial reinforcement, the person or animal does not get reinforced every time they perform the desired behavior. So as you can imagine, it's going to take a little bit longer for them to learn that association. But let's look a little bit further at partial reinforcement. So the ratio equals the amount of times you receive reinforcement. The interval equals the periods of time that you receive the reinforcement. So fixed ratio would be the reinforcement given after action is completed a fixed amount of times, a certain number of times. Fixed interval would be reinforcement given after a fixed period of time if the action is completed. Variable ratio would mean that the reinforcement is given after the action is completed a varying amount of times. And variable interval would mean the reinforcement is given after varying periods of time if the action is completed. So again, the ratio equals the amount of times the action is performed, and the interval equals the periods of time after an action is completed. Thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. I know some of those concepts with both operant and classical conditioning can be a little difficult to understand. So definitely let me know if you need any help with that.